Hey everybody.
Hello. Welcome back to Underqualified, a thing that I am now
Cue our
calling
jingle.
a thing that I am now calling a show instead of a podcast, because I looked up how to make this recording a podcast and it takes a while. So I'm not going to do that for a little bit. But first, before we get into everything, what we first wanted to say was thank you, because holy crap, so many people watched this.
Really? People watch this?
We had like 70 views.
Why?
In like 8
Why?
days.
Why?
And like 14 hours of watch time.
What are y'all doing?
Which means that like at least 12 to 13 people watched the entire thing.
Oh my god. And
So
God bless you. We talked for a while in that first one there.
I was totally blown away by that. But you definitely got us to do another one. So for those of you that liked it, welcome back. For today, I'm going to do one more COVID topic.
This is our last pandemisode, if you
Yeah. Because I had several people reach out to me personally on social media and say the talk about vaccines was really cool and applicable to what we're going through right now, which was the goal. And they wanted more details on the actual COVID vaccine.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And that's really going to be the last time, hopefully for a while, that we even mention what's going on, because that's not the point. We weren't here to talk about.
Right, we really want to distract from COVID more than harping on it. Everybody knows what's happening, and there are so much has been written about the pandemic and COVID, and there's lots of literature out there for you. Yeah. So we've consolidated some of it, maybe. And my topic today is going to be again a little bit more of the softer science side of things. The psychology of social isolation and how that impacts us. And also, I just pulled up a couple of articles on Zoom and FaceTime and other sort of stand-in communication platforms and why they suck. So, yeah, so that's what we're talking about today. And then in the future, if we keep making these, then it'll be totally not COVID related. Hopefully, we feel like we have many other things we want to explore.
Absolutely.
So. All right. And I'm first this week.
You are first.
I get to talk first.
You get to talk first.
Awesome. All right. Yeah. And I have, again, done approximately 15 to 20 minutes of research. We've sort of got this thing going from the first episode as well, where Nicholas talks a little bit more about the biology and chemistry behind whether it's vaccinations or the virus in general, and uses his pharmacy medical background to sort of talk about something that he has studied and knows things about. And somehow I've ended up talking a lot about psychology, and just sort of as a forward, I have no reason to be talking about psychology. I have no degree of any kind, frankly, and certainly no intent to go into the field of psychology, but
we also don't stand by that the topics are going to be related going forward.
No,
so,
yeah.
Just to say that now.
Definitely not. As we were planning this particular episode, we were debating between wanting to do topics that were still sort of interconnected or totally going off the wall and doing, the COVID vaccine and Mario Kart or something like that. So
write that one down. We'll come back to Mario Kart.
Yeah, maybe in a future episode, but so from what I've garnered from these pages that I've pulled up, social isolation is bad.
Okay. I'm with you so far.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I'm tracking with you. I have experienced that social isolation is bad.
Revolutionary stuff from me. And so, honestly, everybody in the world is qualified now to sort of talk about the effects of social isolation. We've all experienced it in one way or another from this lifestyle change that we've had to make over the past nine months or so. And everybody sort of deals with it, and this is just sort of, I'll get to the meat of it later, but I'm just sort of speculating off of my own experience that everybody has completely different experiences, and it doesn't always seem to line up with people's personalities. And so, we can have social introverts who have a really hard time, or more reclusive extroverts who are doing great, but or people who follow the more traditional pattern of you're an extrovert and you're really struggling from the lack of social interaction, or you're an introvert and this is your dream, or anywhere in between.
Right.
Because certainly I'm definitely a social person, and I can appreciate my alone time, but I can tell you that March to May period where it was nothing, and you weren't even here. You were in you were in your college apartment, and so I was here, and it was awful. It was awful. It was like, this is cool for a couple days.
Yeah,
we can read some books, watch Netflix, and after that, it was like, it's just, you
don't want to be doing this anymore.
You want to get back to your routine.
Yeah,
you want to get back to life as the way it was, and so I'm sure everybody can totally relate to that. But the impacts sort of social isolation are a lot more far-reaching than I might have anticipated, and potentially more severe.
I mean, you want to say for the entire pandemic, where it's like, yeah, it's going to be 2 weeks in March, and then we'll be clear, and now it's almost January.
Right.
We've been underestimating since the beginning.
Right. And it makes everything seem, that's the kind of the nice first bit of comfort from this article that I have pulled up, is think about how much more meaningful that's going to be when you get to go back in person and see your coworkers. And it's like, yeah, whatever.
I mean, yeah, I guess.
Thanks for the silver lining, trianglesprings.com. But this was part of my experience, was sleep disruption as a result of not being around other people, which is critical to good mental health.
Sure.
I, as a college student, sort of like to think that I can subsist off of 4 hours of sleep and caffeine for months at a time, and you just keep going. But the impacts of not having a regular routine, of not seeing people on a regular basis, gives you that feeling of, what day is it?
Right.
What time is it?
Right.
What does it even matter? And your circadian rhythm, is that? Yeah, okay.
Yep.
It's like, that sounds right.
Yep.
Yeah. Can get really thrown off. For instance, there's less of a reason to. I think our dog just came down.
Visitor behind the curtain.
Yeah, we have a special guest appearance. You can have, your normal awake during the day, sleeping at night, but during a pandemic, and you're never leaving your home.
What do you care?
What do you care? You can stay up all night and then sleep all day, and the rest of the world wouldn't know any better. And so that can sort of, but I experienced that from March to May. It was the inconsistency, excuse me, of my schedule, especially at first, before you sort of have to lock yourself down into, these are when my few classes are,
right,
and this is when I'm gonna eat meals and try and work out and do things. So I think if I hadn't done that, then I would have been really in a tough spot. And so that sort of regularity is actually really good for your mental health, and taking us so far out of the social structures that sort of helps provide that can be really difficult, leading to insomnia, tossing and turning, even having nightmares, bad dreams, stress dreams, things like that. Obviously, loneliness is a big deal with social isolation, which can lead into depression, can lead into stress and anxiety. And this was sort of the big thing that caught my eye, was the PTSD as a result of extended period of social isolation.
Oh, interesting.
So that can happen. And I really think that that's something that doesn't necessarily come up as much in talking about all of our experiences through the pandemic, regardless of, so many people have lost someone close to them, been impacted in a really personal way by this virus. But even if that's not the case for you, even if you haven't lost someone close to you, you still experienced a trauma.
Yeah. And
that's really what this whole 9 months has been a period of trauma. And so, speaking post-COVID, I think that there are going to be some long-lasting mental health impacts from this time, even when the vaccine has been administered and we're sort of getting back to normal life, I think that that's going to become more and more of a conversation of what sort of happened during the pandemic and how that still lingers in our day-to-day life when hopefully, next year things are starting to get back to normal. And I think that I'm hopeful that we'll have a lot of grace for that and not put a timetable on people to say, well, yeah, put all that behind you.
It's done, so be better now.
Yeah, you're able to get back to your normal life now, so stop struggling, right. I guess. Because, whether, as I said, whether you've lost someone or not, you've experienced a trauma, and for some people, that it's been a much bigger deal than just the sort of frustration of not being able to go out and see my friends, not being able to do the normal things that I like to do. All of those things for me personally have been a bummer. Right. But there's some real scarring that can come from that and can linger potentially.
Well, and without having looked at the actual definition of PTSD, I mean, the way that acronym has kind of been contextualized in the media and in our conversation about it sort of construes it as violence dependent. In that it's, soldiers coming home from serving, which is, I'm not saying that is not PTSD. It absolutely is, and it's a huge problem. But we, I think, in our sort of societal brain have kind of locked it into, it's that kind of trauma. But it's just talking about trauma, losing your job, losing family members, being forced inside for extended periods of time. All of those things count as trauma, even though a violent act was not involved at all.
Right.
And, in my mind, if I think PTSD, I think, a survivor or a soldier of a crisis, of some really violent, traumatic event. But that's not necessarily what's being discussed. It's just trauma.
Certainly.
In general.
Right. And especially in this particular case, it may not have been one event. It's sort of the effects of long-term, low-level but constant stress, which is super unhealthy for your body, just chemically, biologically speaking. And we're all sort of we all know that the situation that we're living in is not ideal, not sustainable, and we all just sort of have to deal with it. Yeah. and so that's the frustrating part, is you can look at all of this and say, man, yeah, I really know that this is not doing a lot of good things for my mental or physical health long term, but in the interest of specifically protecting people's physical health from the virus, we sort of make that sacrifice. So, but continuing to talk about the impacts of social isolation, I just wanted to bring this up because I think it's fascinating. Okay. So, 1972, French adventurer and scientist he's French. I have no idea. Chiffre. Michel space Siffre.
French was always my least favorite language to sing. Nothing against French people.
I took a whole class on how to pronounce French words this past semester for my music degree, and I apparently learned nothing. So we'll just call him the French adventurer. I don't know. But he shut himself in a cave in Texas in 1972 for more than 6 months.
Whoa.
Which still clocks in as one of the longest self-isolation experiments in history. And so he didn't just do that. Obviously, he's a scientist. And so this was for sort of the what's going to happen.
You don't have to get approval if you're experimenting on yourself.
It's totally ethical because he did it to himself. And so he was taking meticulous notes on how his behavioral patterns and mental capacities were impacted throughout the 6-month period of isolation.
Man.
And that's, going into a cave without Netflix.
Just in the 70s, you were alone.
Yeah. Without FaceTime to talk to your family. And so he's really, that's isolation without any of these alleviating factors that we've
truly just being a hermit.
Exactly. And he wrote that he could barely string thoughts together after a couple of months. And so it was that stark of a contrast. By the 5-month mark, he was so desperate for company that he tried unsuccessfully to befriend a mouse. Which is just like, dude,
that really,
that's brutal.
That hurts to listen to hear.
And so it's amazing to me, just on the account of the experience. Like, I couldn't imagine being by yourself for 205 days. Oh my gosh. But on the other end of that, just the level of self-discipline, there's nothing, he's not trapped in the cave. He's waking up every day and choosing to continue this experiment that he's doing on himself. And I think about my own levels of self-discipline and how much I struggled to go to 2-hour-long Zoom classes in a day.
To not eat that candy bar that you know is upstairs.
But just like how much was too much to ask of me when I was not even in this level of social isolation, because I was still at home with family, but just unable to go out and be social. That was the sacrifice. And what then became so much harder for me to conjure the energy to do. And so, I don't know. I mean, this guy, whose name I can't pronounce, Mikhail Sifra. Hats off to you. I don't know if he's still alive, because this was in 1972. Let's see.
That's unbelievable. I mean, that's even worse than you hear talks every few years of, a space type project where they lock 7 or 8 people into an area to simulate living on Mars. I've heard of that on a couple of occasions, and it never goes well.
Yeah.
It almost always ends early because they all hate each other by the end of it, just because of the forced proximity. But, gosh, he didn't even have people. I mean, it goes to show you that humans will pack bond with absolutely anything. That he tried to befriend a mouse. Domesticate a mouse on the fly.
And that's the saddest part for me, is that his potential mouse friend did not really want to hang out with him. And so we could do a whole other episode on this man, because it's pretty fascinating, and the effects of that time on his brain are pretty impressive. Just what he lost out on in terms of capabilities just from the removed stimulus from talking to other people, and how desperate he became for interaction. But I'm sort of running further into my time, and so I want to talk a little bit about some of those alleviating factors that we've used during this time of increased social isolation, such as Zoom, which gets used a lot for educational purposes, but also can be used socially, and also things, even expanding it to FaceTime, Skype, things that we were using pre-pandemic, and just why that interaction feels so different than talking to somebody face to face. And I think every student certainly has experienced the awkward breakout room where you're thrown in there with 3 other people that you kind of know, and then just sit in an uncomfortable, stony silence for 5 to 10 minutes.
When you're supposed to be discussing something.
Exactly. Until you mercifully get called back into the main room, and then you just have more people to sit in an uncomfortable, stony silence when the teacher asks a question. And so, that's so foreign. There have been few other circumstances in my life where I'll sit down with a group of people and not try to fill the silence. Certainly if there's space, you just sort of fill it with small talk and enjoy interacting with other people. And on Zoom, it just feels impossible. And not only that, it feels exhausting to try and make that same thing happen. And part of that, there's some interesting articles that have been written about Zoom fatigue, that term that's been coined, and why our Zoom classes, specifically for students, feel so much more exhausting than our usual slate of in-person classes. And a big part of that is this sort of idea that you are always under the microscope. If you're in Zoom with your video on, then potentially someone could always be looking at you.
Oh, I could see you at all times.
Yeah, you're always aware that you are visible to other people.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a little bit of your brain energy that is devoted to saying, like, am I looking presentable? Which I don't worry about for Zoom classes.
If you're in a class like I am, where my video is required to be on all the time.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so that feels very different, because when you're in person in class, in a row of desks looking forward at the whiteboard, you might be under the microscope when you're raising your hand to ask a question, but that's 2 minutes out of the hour as opposed to the entire hour. And so, and just the presentation of Zoom, this glowing box around your face when you're talking, feels like every eyeball's on you. I'm quoting from this New York Times article that I've got pulled up. It feels like this particular person, that they're Mr. Nitkowitz. I don't know where he's from. Dave Nitkowitz, employee of Experience Grand Rapids. Okay.
Absolutely.
He says it feels like an intimidating job interview, which I definitely agree with. It's difficult for it to feel like your casual interaction, your fun thing, which is why, especially since I associate that platform more with class and with learning than with hanging out with
sure, yeah.
social. Yeah. And so the other big interesting point that I want to make about this is the disruption of the normal flow of how information is conveyed during a conversation. And so there's a lot that's going on as I'm talking to you with my facial expression that's getting to you right away.
Right.
And you might actually sort of mirror me as I'm talking. That's scientifically, that's what we do in a conversation. We sort of respond to the information that we're getting from the other person with the same sort of mannerisms.
Okay.
And so that happens very intuitively, very naturally. And basically, when it happens with the delay of going through a screen, I'm going through some sort of online communication tool, it just totally disrupts the rhythm. And so everything, and that happens just because,
just some latency.
You're asking a question and then having to wait for a response. And so there's a delay there while a person is like, the audio is coming through and they're saying, oh yeah, I've been asked a question, and then they have to unmute their microphone. And so that's very obvious how the flow is disrupted. But also, just because it's through a screen, those more nuanced physical expressions are much more difficult to convey. And that's more subtly a big part of what makes it feel natural to be talking to someone, what makes a conversation feel easy.
Well, and because, like, from a technological standpoint, if you're having bandwidth or connection problems, Zoom will drop your FPS to like sometimes 10 frames a second or lower, and you might not even see it. Maybe the teacher raises their eyebrows or they smile or something, but it's so brief that you literally don't even witness it because the camera doesn't pick it up if their connection is bad.
So you're absolutely right, and you might not see the little smirk that somebody has as they're saying something sarcastic if the connection is bad, and those subtleties of inflection, the subtleties of facial expression, can totally change the meaning of something that is said, and
suddenly becomes very hurtful.
Yeah, exactly, and so it's all kinds of bad, and that's why we all know that this is not, or we hope that this is not ever going to be perceived as the new normal. I keep leaning out of the frame. Sorry. Amateur hour.
We tried to crop the nightmare that is our cluttered basement out of the frame, so now we're kind of leaning in here, and we've got our screen up behind us.
Well, when we were thinking about this as a podcast, it was like, who cares about the background? Right. Now here we are with our webcast.
With a video,
looking like goobers.
So well.
But, yeah, so I just think that's really fascinating to me, is the technology. I'm quoting Brenda Weatherhold. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Where is she from? in a thought-provoking editorial in the journal Cyber Psychology. Okay, thank you, Brenda. Technology can disrupt our normal, intricate human communication methods that have been finely tuned over centuries to help humans survive. So I feel pretty comfortable talking to human beings when I see them live and in the flesh. Not all the time. I mean, some people are just scary, but
yeah, no,
yeah. But in general, I feel like I can hold a conversation. And Zoom, FaceTime, after a while, it's just like it strips me of my powers. I'm like, I stare at the screen and I'm like,
I'm just here.
I'm just here, man. And also my desire to participate, especially in an educational setting. I would describe myself in high school, in particular, as Hermione Granger, like, where it's like,
try to answer every question.
I know, I want to participate, and so there are so many times this semester where I can tell that a question has been asked. And there's hope that there will be a response by my professor. And I also can acknowledge that I know the answer. And I am nowhere close to unmuting my microphone
I've done that
to participate in class. It's just, it feels so different.
Yeah.
And it feels, to me, I've always felt like it goes back to that disruption of the rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's the standard now that a question gets asked and the teacher waits until they get tired of waiting and then they just continue.
Okay.
And so I sort of get this vibe like, I don't want to mess with them. And I know that's silly because everyone who is teaching online right now is like, please, for the love of God, engage with me.
Just have a camera on even if
exactly. But as a student, there's so little incentive to do that because it feels so artificial and so surface level, all of the interactions. And on top of that, it feels like you're taking a risk every time you get involved, because if you take the time to unmute, your professor hears you and you're totally off base, then it's like, thanks, Ben, that was not anything that we wanted to
try.
Hear. So I'm planning to be an educator, and so I empathize so much with everyone who's struggling to, I mean, can't really empathize because I wasn't teaching, but I sympathize with everyone who struggled to jerry-rig an online curriculum for this year. And I'm sorry that I am the way that I am to all of my professors, and I was one of the many who didn't want to participate, but hopefully just talking about this gives us a little bit more of an idea of why that's so difficult and why it's not an easy transfer just to get on FaceTime and just to get on Zoom. And so we should constantly, have grace for our professors who are trying to make this work, and also have lots of grace for our students who are, dealing with so much as well in the transition to online learning. And beyond that, everybody is dealing with this for in a certain capacity for their work or whatever, and that it takes a toll.
Have some grace with yourself too. Self-care.
Yeah. And so I was going to get a little bit more into, I want to respect your time.
You got a whole 4 minutes.
Oh, do I really?
Yeah.
Okay.
We do like 30 minutes each.
Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to hopefully throw some positives out there on, rather than just talking about the downsides of being socially isolated, and talk about some things that the science says can be helpful. And on top of that, when we transition to Nicholas's topic, we're hopefully going to be looking forward to a world post-COVID. And so regardless of anything else, there is a light at the end of the tunnel.
Right.
But this article that I have pulled up has a couple of general sort of ideas for feeling more connected, even during this time of being apart. And this particular article stresses exercise a ton, which everybody knows is good for your mental health baseline, but especially right now, it's so tempting to wake up at noon and
be a couch potato,
sit on the couch all day, and it feels like it's a big effort to get up and do anything, but that just the action of being able to look at your day and say, I did this today. I got up and walked around for 15 minutes outside, or I got up and I did 15 push-ups or whatever, or however many push-ups you can do. For me, it's like 2. And but that can really boost your mood. And of course, we just talked about how staying in touch over digitally is not a stand-in for in-person interaction, but the action that is sort of the avenue that's available to us right now.
Right.
And so checking in with each other frequently, making it known to people that you care about how they're doing, regardless of whether you're frequent communicators or it's totally out of the blue, that's a really big deal, to just validate somebody and recognize that they exist. And actually, in being there for that person, it's also a mental health boost for you. So that's sort of like the symbiosis of of checking in with other people, letting them know that they are cared about, and that action is also going to be helpful to you. And also, this is my favorite, consider adopting a pet.
Aw, yay.
Get a mouse friend, like our friend Michael the Sifra.
Force that mouse to like you by keeping it in your home.
Exactly. They can be a source of comfort, may also lower stress and blood pressure. So go out and pick up one of those stray cats that's out on there.
You're coming with me now. Maybe don't do that.
Disclaimer. That was a joke.
Maybe get something from the shelter that has had shots.
Has vaccinations.
And hopefully no bugs.
Yeah, but, I just, at the end of all of this, I certainly hope that everybody is hanging in there, and encourage you to continue to check in on other people as much as you can and let them know that they're cared about, because that's extra important during this time. And there's a light at the end of the tunnel, whether that's getting back to normalcy at the end of this year, or an end of next year, hopefully, or whether that's getting yourself a pet mouse to tide you over until the end of the pandemic. So.
Well, and of course, the best way to fix the problems that come with social isolation is to remove the social isolation.
Of course, yeah.
Which is going to be my rather rocky segue into the COVID vaccine, because that is probably our best bet at ending the period of social isolation that we are currently in. And I know that mRNA vaccine and COVID vaccine is all over the news, pretty much wherever you get your news media, regardless of the opinion on the COVID vaccine, is talking about the COVID vaccine. So I'm going to strip, hopefully, a large portion of the opinion and just talk about what it is, what is an mRNA vaccine, because I know that for a lot of people that is completely and that's understandable because, and this has sort of been lost in the wash of developing this vaccine for COVID, there has never been an mRNA vaccine before. It's not been done. And so I'm going to bring it all the way back, and I'm going to talk about what RNA is, because in order to sort of build our way forward, we've got to start with that level. So I think everybody knows what DNA is on a certain level. It's that double-stranded spinny thing that's inside all of our...
double helix.
Exactly. It's that, double-sided spinny thing that is in every cell of our body, which its code defines who we are in a certain extent. From a biological standpoint, what you are going to look like, how you're going to develop, your risk or lack of risk for certain diseases, everything comes from your DNA. So
you can't talk about DNA without doing a plug for Rosalind Franklin. We know it's a double
absolutely
helix
because of her.
Franklin, not those other
not
two
Watson
dudes
and Crick,
who came later.
Yes, no, absolutely. And so RNA is a little bit less well understood. It's not quite as well talked about in your rudimentary biology classes. But there is.
You mean like the ones I've taken?
Well, like ones in high school that you are forced to take before you get to go to college.
Rudimentary.
Yeah. I'm not saying that as an insult. It's just, if you're not going into biology, you're probably not going to take many bio courses when you're in college. And so there is a hypothesis that RNA actually predates DNA somewhat substantially, because there's evidence that RNA has enzymatic activity, which that's a big scary word that means that it on its own can do things, can do chemical processes. And so there is some evidence, there is a suggestion that when early life on Mars, Earth, was just starting to develop. We're talking billions of years ago.
It's mRNA because it
stands for Mars. No, the billions of years ago might be the only thing that was functioning. The most basic biological metabolic processes were carried out by RNA. And so what it has become in our bodies, and specifically what mRNA is, and the M stands for messenger, is
Not Mars.
Not Mars. It's the actual answer.
Dang.
Is it codes and facilitates protein development within our cells. And proteins, there's a joke in biochemistry classes, if you've taken one, I'm sure that you've heard it. It's, if you don't know the answer, it's probably protein. So just say, proteins. And you might get a couple points on that exam that you don't know the answer to. Because proteins, I'm not talking like the proteins that make your muscles huge, although those are important, but proteins carry out basically every function within the human body on some level. Everything that happens from your mental acuity to your digestion to, insert name of thing here, has proteins involved in some part along the way, if not every step of the process. And so RNA and mRNA are extremely important because mRNA exits the nucleus where that DNA to protein process starts to occur, transitions to the cytoplasm of the cell, which is a big word that means the space inside the cell, where it is read, and then from that mRNA strand is read into protein, which is all enzymatic processes that we don't need to get into. The important thing to understand is that mRNA is used to create the proteins that make our body function. Our immune system is not separate from that. And so the idea behind the mRNA vaccine is actually simplifying the vaccination process, because viruses and bacteria do this exact same thing. So all of the proteins that they express on a cellular level are coded for by mRNA. And so if you could inject a little snippet of an mRNA vaccine, excuse me, I got the burps, if you could inject a little snippet of mRNA from either a bacteria or a virus, you could get your cells to produce that little identifying protein in the immune system. And so when whatever pathogen that is enters the body, you would instantaneously recognize it. And you would not actually be injecting any part of the bacterium or virus into your system. So we talked a little bit last time about how there's all different types of vaccines. You got your toxoid, your whole particle, all of these different things. And while the risk for those is almost non-existent, it does exist in particular for individuals who are severely immunocompromised. Because there is an extremely minute chance that in those individuals who are extremely immunocompromised, the virus or bacterium from something like a live attenuated, which means deactivated vaccine, could enter their body, and because their immune system is so weak, could begin to replicate and actually create an infection.
Oh, wow.
That is only true in I'm talking an infinitesimally small portion of the population. There's really severe cases of immunodeficiency. But mRNA can actually address part of that, because there is no portion of whatever illness you're vaccinating for that enters the body. It's just the mRNA strand, and you use your own cells to create that little identifier, which then resides forever.
Right. And so, forgive me if you're going to talk about this later, but so the idea that there hasn't been an mRNA vaccine before, can you explain a little bit about sort of why there hasn't been an mRNA vaccine before? What's is it just lack of familiarity with the uses of RNA, or
it stems in large part from what I briefly mentioned the last time we recorded this, which was that RNA is extremely unstable because it's single-stranded. So if DNA runs like this, RNA only runs like this, and that just inside the body, there's so many more things that can make that fall apart and disintegrate. And so there's an article in the Harvard Health Publishing Harvard Medical School by Dr. Anthony Komaroff, Komaroff. So that's pretty close.
We're killing names today.
And what I looked up is, why is an mRNA-based vaccine so exciting for the medical community? And so the vaccination world, which is a thing, immunologists have been working on an mRNA-based vaccine for almost 30 years.
Wow.
Because the exact idea that I just mentioned in like a sentence, how can we make vaccines easier? The answer is likely going to be mRNA, because it's relatively easy and cheap to create in a lab, and you can use a correctly coded section of mRNA to create a protein for anything. Because mRNA is mRNA. It's not like viral mRNA is toxic to humans. It's still just mRNA. It's what the virus or the bacteria does that makes you sick. It's not the mRNA within it. It's just a sequence of nucleic acids. And so in the case of the COVID vaccine, it's called spike protein, which some of the more deep dives on the news might have talked about spike proteins, but it's just a portion of the COVID-19 viral body that is recognized by our immune system. So if you can get our immune system and our cells to create the spike protein so that our immune system already knows what it looks like, if you encounter an individual who has COVID-19 and you take in some of those particles, your immune system will instantaneously recognize and attack.
Right.
But because it's only expressed on your immune cells, it's not a harm to your body just being in there. It's the exact same process of if you get a cold, and your body will take in and absorb a particle of whatever it is that you've got, chew it up, and express those proteins, so that next time something comes into your body that is that exact same infection, your immune system latches onto it, which is how our adaptive immune system works.
Right.
And it's why you don't get as sick if you are to get reinfected in most cases.
Gotcha. So then could you make an mRNA vaccine for the common cold?
So that is something that we can talk about at a later date, because the common cold is actually a conglomerate of upwards of 200 different viruses, which is why there is no vaccination for the common cold. But
well, and this is a total aside, but I do vaguely remember from one of my rudimentary biology courses talking about why phages, which is just another word for virus, right? Why that sort of basically.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
You know, but why it hasn't been explored more, as like we trend more towards antibiotics in our response to colds and viruses than we do to viral, treatments. Right. And so with a virus like COVID, it's always going to be a specific response. And so you have the RNA of a virus used to combat that same virus.
Right.
So it's like one treatment to one illness, right? Whereas with bacterial infections, you can hit it with an antibiotic and it kills all the bacteria.
Right. It works against classes of bacteria, because they all have similar structures.
But it's more of a widespread impact, which makes it more appealing for more marketable, I guess, is what I'm saying. So it's because of capitalism,
Please don't go into your doctor's office and ask for an antibiotic if you have a cold. Please. Antibiotics do not work on viruses, and it's making our population more antibiotic resistant when you take them when you don't need them. That's total sidebar. Stop doing that. If you are one of those people, you listening at home, if you have the common cold and you just have runny nose and a sore throat, do not go in and demand a Z-Pack from your doctor, because it's not going to do anything, and it's making our population antibiotic resistant. Anyway, you asked what makes the development so challenging. And so there's actually a section right here that says overcoming obstacles in creating mRNA vaccines. So
that's great.
First of all,
let's explore that section.
You have to modify mRNA so that you don't get a violent immune system response. And that just makes sense sort of on a general level. You're thinking, well, we're going to inject something that's going to simulate a foreign particle, which the whole reason that our immune system exists is to attack foreign particles. So if you take that foreign particle and not like, don't put it on your skin, it's not like sort of seeping in through one of your mucous membranes, like you're injecting it into your bloodstream. If you don't formulate that correctly, which is why being an immunologist is such a big deal, things can go very poorly. When vaccines were first being developed, I'm talking centuries ago, there are instances of people, you just try to inject whatever it is that you're trying to inoculate against, and they have a massive immune response, which is not good. Second of all, you have to get the body to consume the mRNA as it's floating through. So that's sort of opposite sides of the same problem, right? So you don't want it to produce such a reaction that you actually die from shock.
Sure, yeah.
But at the same time, it has to respond a little bit. Otherwise, why are we doing this? You're not going to get any long-term immunity if it's just floating through your blood, not doing anything. And at the same time, you have to make those immune cells express the protein, not just destroy it. So what macrophages, which is one of the first line responders in our immune system, do is they consume these foreign things and they express various proteins, like I mentioned earlier, so that if that infection occurs again, that response doesn't take as long because you will already have identifiers laid in. But what they do first is consume it. And so if you're putting things into the body that just get consumed, then you've done nothing. And
Right.
because mRNA and RNA as a whole are so unstable, you have to actually encapsulate each molecule, or each portion of the vaccine in something, because it's not going to survive the trip into your system in all likelihood if you don't. Which the processes for how that happens is far more complicated than I have time to talk about in 30 minutes, and frankly is beyond my understanding in some cases. I mean, they talk about in here how you can encapsulate sections of mRNA in like a little lipid globule, which is the science biological term for fats. And so you just sort of, I don't know, it just kind of forms around it and it goes in so it doesn't get destroyed. That breaks down and immune things happen. This is called Underqualified. I don't really know how that works.
You got some lipids,
sounds
you
really...
got some RNA, you go, shoop, and they're together, and then it floats.
So, if there is a silver lining to the development, to the situation that we are in right now, and the development of the COVID vaccine, it is that we have been working on an mRNA vaccine technology for the better part of 30 years. So, when this virus began to take hold, it was sequenced in China in days.
Right.
And so within a couple days after that, these labs all across the world that had already been working on this mRNA technology, in theory, were suddenly going, oh, we're live. This is happening. We're doing this now.
There's a great graphic for, if we had the budget to edit it and put it up on screen, we totally would. But just describing the timeline of the progress towards a COVID vaccine.
Yeah.
And it was, clinical trials began in
something like that.
Late
Yeah, I don't have it off the top of my head.
Late March.
Yeah.
I would have to pull it up to tell you for sure. But the speed at which this has happened, as much as we've all wished that this would have been resolved sooner, is really remarkable.
Oh, yeah.
And the idea that we would have a vaccine before 2020 was done, when we first started talking about COVID, seemed pretty
almost incomprehensible.
And when I knew basically nothing about what coronavirus was, I was talking to you about it while you were taking your epidemiology.
I was in a pathogenic microbiome class. Yeah.
Microbiome. You were like, well, we can't really make a vaccine for COVID, and I was like, well, darn.
Which was true at the time, as far as we understood. Because coronaviruses, it's a class, are thought to, it's not thought to, they do mutate extremely quickly. Some coronaviruses cause the common cold. And so part of the reason that we don't have a vaccine for coronaviruses is because they mutate so rapidly that there's no point. You know, the vaccine that you had 6 months ago doesn't work anymore. And so for whatever reason, and I say for whatever reason because as far as I know, this is not entirely well understood. COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2 is not doing that. There are strains of it. You know, I've heard talk of like 6 different strains, but that's such a smaller, more manageable number compared to, I mean, there can be hundreds of serotypes of particular viruses. And that, I mean, there's just no way, because you would have to have a vaccine that addresses every single one of those serotypes, which serotype is just like, it's hard. You don't want to use the word species with viruses because viruses aren't alive, but like deviations from a viral norm, if you will, that still fit within one virus. And so if you have to make a vaccine for all of them, it's just not feasible. But anyway, so all of these labs are working sort of passively across the US and around the world on this mRNA problem, and theoretically have the capability to begin formulating RNA-based vaccines. They just aren't, because research is still ongoing. Right. And then what might arguably be the largest single research project in the history of humankind has started happening around us. And within minutes of the genes being sequenced, this is an exact quote, scientists 10,000 miles away began working on the design of an mRNA vaccine. Within weeks, they had enough vaccine to test it in animals and then in people. And just 11 months after the discovery of SARS-CoV-2, regulators in the United States and the UK confirmed that an mRNA vaccine for COVID-19 is effective, safely tolerated, and is making its way towards being a solution for widespread immunization. And so really the part that I wanted to touch on almost more than anything is this very last section in this article where he says that no scientific breakthrough stands alone. Because this almost a year of work comes on 30 years of mRNA research, which comes from hundreds of years of attempting to understand biology in the world around us. But going forward, the impact of having an mRNA vaccine that works, and this is when I'm trying to like keep a lid on it because I don't want to give people expectations that the scientific community can't meet, because this is all, this is, we're like, you know, if scientific progress is here, the COVID vaccine's like probably out here. Like it's like out in front of what we actually have fully sort of wrapped into our day-to-day understanding. It is beyond cutting edge, I would say.
Yeah.
But because mRNA it just is a thing that the body uses to code for proteins. In theory, which is it could be used to make vaccines for everything. Because anything that uses mRNA in its biological process of replicating and causing illness, you can use mRNA to prevent it, because you just get your body to generate those proteins that I've been talking about for whatever it is that you're hoping to treat.
By everything, do you mean any virus, or like literally any
virus, bacterium, genetic disorders?
Wow.
There is a thought that you might be able to use an mRNA-based treatment to get patients with cystic fibrosis to generate the protein that they're missing in their lungs that leads to fluid buildup. Because a lot of genetic disorders like that, it's either a malformed or a non-existent protein, which means that the system then does not function the way that it's supposed to. Yeah. Specifically, there's one in cystic fibrosis, which is the one that they briefly mentioned in here, that in most cystic fibrosis patients, if you simply fix that protein, the system still works. So, you know, there's all these steps in the process, and the last one doesn't work, so you get a buildup of fluid because it's the system that removes fluid from the lungs. If you just fix that last little protein, the system should, in theory, still run. So, this, you know, when I looked up why is an mRNA vaccine such a big deal, this is why it's such a big deal, because it doesn't just have to be a vaccine. It's a vaccine currently because what we need is an immune response to an illness.
Right.
But the technology, if it can be expanded to be an injection of a certain specific code of mRNA, is earth-shatteringly important. I mean, the capability of such technology is almost unfathomable.
So do you think, like, in the next 10 to 15 years, there will be an overwhelming number of research studies into mRNA? Do you think that's going to be like the hot new thing in the scientific community, or is this going to be sort of an even longer game where, you know, 30 to 40 years down the line, we're still maybe having some isolated success here and there with mRNA? If you were to predict, if you were a betting man.
I mean, the way that genetics research has advanced just in our lifetime, and I'm going to count mRNA as sort of as part of genetic research because mRNA is in the gene replication process. I mean, the first time that we what's the word that I'm looking for? Codified the human genome. So you got all the A's, C's, T's, and G's, and you got them in order. That took something like 10 years and several $1 billion. There was a race. It was like the space race of genetics. And there were several labs across the world that were racing to see who could develop and verify the human genome. I mean, that happened in the 90s, and now you can buy a kit from 23andMe for $200 and get your genome sequenced personally, your genome, not like the human genome, yours.
Your genome.
And it tells you the risk that you have of various diseases. It tells you where you're probably from based on your mitochondrial DNA. I mean, that was within like 25 years.
Right.
And if you extrapolated the math of like price and time and improvement, you know, from that to other sources of technology, or like cars, you know, your car now, based on when they were first developed, so like mass produced, let's say Henry Ford back in the early 20th century, it should, you know, it's something unbelievable. You know, it costs like 5 cents, it gets 2 million miles to the gallon, and, you know, it runs forever. You know, that's the kind of exponential improvement in understanding and technology that we experience with genetics. So, is the COVID vaccine another catalyst for that? I don't know. And I'm not going to say that it is, because even though this is underqualified, it's not a claim that I am personally willing to put a stake in.
And I don't blame you for that, but it certainly won't be the same monumental devotion of resources to one particular study.
Yeah.
Everything that will sort of be the ripple effects of having an mRNA vaccine will be more isolated, we'll have lower budgets, so there will be fewer people working on it. And so progress in that vein is not going to happen overnight. It's really quite unprecedented to have a timeline like this for the COVID vaccine, and the reason it happened is just because it was so overwhelmingly the focus.
Well, and there's a difference there, because talking about the human genome, there was one goal there, versus now with this technology, it's like, well, let's look at HIV, which there's currently not an immunization for. Let's look at cystic fibrosis. Let's look at all of these other genetic conditions that can be fixed by getting your body to create the proteins that you need to. And so there's going to be all of these tangential derivative projects that take off from this discovery, which is why I would lean more towards it taking a longer time, because there won't be just one goal. But the ability to make this work is up there in my mind with CRISPR. which is something that I have not talked about yet, but I would very much like to.
Coming to a podcast near you.
Which is a technology that essentially allows scientists to, in a lab, to modify genes in living organisms. Which, the ethical considerations of that are far-reaching.
Science fiction stuff,
but again, if you have a genetic condition that you have proteins that, you've got just this one section of DNA that is formulated incorrectly, CRISPR, in theory, could go in, bisect that out, put in the right one, and you're done. That's it.
Right.
So are we there with either of those technologies yet? No, not even close. Should we be? That's a more psychological discussion. Is that something that we have a right to do, to go in and edit our genetic makeup? There is no scientific answer for that. That's a personal question.
Future episode for me. The softer sciences.
But what I am trying to say, and what I am trying to bring across to everybody, to you and to everybody who is listening, is that not only does the COVID-19 vaccine hopefully signify the short order end of the social isolation that you were talking about earlier, but if this breakthrough leads to further breakthroughs, it could be one of the most valuable medical discoveries and pieces of scientific research since vaccines became which
I think that's a really beautiful thing to hold on to, is just during this time that's been so difficult, there's something that's so exciting and so hopeful in the scientific community to look to. And so maybe we don't talk about getting back to normal next fall, we talk about getting back to a world that's better.
Let's go beyond. Let's make it better than it was before.
And that's a really that's so powerful. And if that's what ends up coming out of something as tragic as the last 9 months, then what else can we hope for? So
100%. We're gonna call it there. We've been talking for quite a long time. We appreciate those of you who have come along again for this episode and those who watched the first episode. If you have things that you would like for us to talk about, that would be cool to know.
That'd be great.
Let us know what you want to know about.
Suggestions for the future, things that we messed up this time.
Yep.
Please let us know about. If anybody knows how to pronounce people's names.
Some phonetics lessons would be great.
I think that we got them all wrong.
Yep.
I read IPA, so
as always, the 3 rules for our podcast: we tried to only say things that were true as far as we're aware of. 2, if you know better than we do, please correct us. It's probably going to be something that I said wrong because I talked about a lot of things that I only partially understand. So please do research of your own from verifiable, trustable sources. Don't just take me at my word. I am just one man who did very brief research, who has a passion for medicine. Correct me if I've been wrong, because I want to learn. That's part of this process, is to learn more. And the third and most important rule: be nice, take care of yourselves, and have a great day, everybody.
Peace out.
Bye.
See you next time.